Today, the air here smells like fresh pastries and new bathroom tiles. People push shopping carts where the industrial heart of Britain once pulsed with life. 50 years ago, this roar was known as the second heartbeat of Birmingham. 50,000 people worked here every day, building more than just cars. They were building a nation's pride. Now, on the site of the legendary Longbridge plant, there is only a parking lot. The Rover name lives on in history books, but the soul of this place vanished with the final blow of the factory whistle. How did a global empire turn into a food court? This is the story of the Rover factory, the slow death of a British icon. As we dive into the rise and fall of this giant, I want to hear from you. Which legendary company or forgotten factory would you like to see in our next investigation? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more stories of industrial empires and the business decisions that changed the course of history, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. The story begins, as so many British industrial stories begin, in Coventry. In the late 1870s, the city was already what it would remain for the next century, a place where people made things, where the craft of manufacturing had settled into the streets and the workshops and the particular confidence of a population that understood precision. Coventry made watches, it made ribbons and weaving machines, it made bicycles, which in the 1870s and 1880s were not yet the ordinary domestic objects they would become, but mechanical novelties at the frontier of personal transportation, machines that required engineering skill to design and manufacturing discipline to produce in quantity. It was into this world that John Kemp Starley and William Sutton established their partnership in 1878. The name Starley chose was deliberate. Rover. The word meant wanderer, traveller, a thing unbound. It carried no weight of tradition and no limitation of geography. It suggested movement for its own sake, the freedom of the open road at a time when the open road was becoming, for the first time, accessible to people who were not wealthy enough to keep horses. It was a name designed to travel. It did. The Rover safety bicycle, introduced in 1885, was one of the machines that made cycling practical for ordinary people. 2 wheels of equal size, chain-driven rear wheel, a riding position that didn't require the nerve of a circus performer. Starley established the basic form that every bicycle since has followed. He didn't invent the safety bicycle outright. He refined it, and the refinement was so thorough and so well judged that it became the template. The machines sold. The company grew. And the reputation that Rover would carry for the next 100 years, the reputation for doing things properly, for building with care, for producing machines that were not the most daring but were among the most dependable, began here, in a Coventry workshop, with a bicycle that worked the way a bicycle should. The transition to motorcars came at the turn of the century, as it did for so many bicycle manufacturers who understood that the skills required to build one kind of machine could be applied to another. Rover produced its first car in 1904, an 8-horsepower machine, modest by any standard. But it represented the beginning of a commitment to 4 wheels that would define the company for the rest of its existence. The early cars were cautious in the way that Rover would remain cautious for decades, well-built, reliable, never quite at the cutting edge of performance or style, but never far behind it either. The company understood its market. It was not making cars for people who wanted to race. It was making cars for people who wanted to arrive. By the 1930s, Rover had settled into an identity that the British class system understood instinctively. A Rover was the car of the professional man, the solicitor, the doctor, the senior civil servant. Not a Rolls-Royce, which was beyond his means, and not an Austin or a Morris, which was beneath his self-image. A Rover sat in the space between aspiration and respectability, and it sat there with a quietness that was itself a statement. The Viking longship badge on the bonnet carried associations of exploration and strength, but the cars themselves were domestic, sensible, to the vehicular equivalent of a well-cut tweed jacket. There was nothing wrong with that. There was, in fact, a great deal right with it. Rover knew what it was. The difficulty, when it came, would arrive precisely because other people decided that what Rover was needed to become something else. The Second World War interrupted everything. Rover's works produced aircraft engines during the conflict, including early work on Frank Whittle's jet engine before the project was transferred to Rolls-Royce in an exchange that gave Rover a tank engine facility instead. There is something almost too fitting about that swap. Rover gave away the future of aviation and received in return the machinery of ground-level endurance. It was, in miniature, the story the company would tell for the next 60 years. But the post-war period also produced the thing that would become Rover's most significant creation. More significant than any saloon car. More enduring than any badge or boardroom decision. In 1947, Maurice Wilks, Rover's chief engineer, was using a surplus military Jeep on his farm in Anglesey. The Jeep was wearing out. Replacements were hard to come by. Wilks, in the way that engineers solve problems, began sketching an alternative on the beach, a lightweight, go-anywhere utility vehicle that could be built using Rover's existing capacity and sold to the agricultural and military markets that needed such a thing. The sketches became prototypes. The prototypes became the Land Rover, launched at the Amsterdam Motor Show in 1948. It was not beautiful. It was not comfortable. It was not, in any conventional sense, a Rover. It was functional, rugged, built from an aluminium alloy because steel was rationed, painted in military surplus green because that was the paint available. It was designed to work. It worked. The Land Rover was Rover's accidental masterpiece, a machine conceived as a stopgap that became a global product sold in countries and conditions that the Solihull boardroom could barely have imagined. It went to farms and battlefields, to deserts and jungles, to the kind of places where machinery either functions or kills you. It became, over decades, one of the most recognized vehicles on Earth, an object whose silhouette alone communicated capability and endurance. It also became, in time, the most valuable thing Rover owned. And because it was the most valuable thing Rover owned, it would eventually be the thing that was taken from them. That sentence deserves more weight than it carries. Remember it. The 1950s and 1960s were the years when Rover became what people of a certain age still mean when they say the name. Not the company that made Land Rovers, though that was increasingly the profitable part of the business. The Rover that mattered in the public imagination was the maker of saloon cars that occupied a very particular place in British life. A place that said something about the person who drove one before they had opened their mouth or produced a business card. The P4, produced from 1949 to 1964, was the car that established this identity most firmly. It was not fast. It was not flashy. It was, in almost every respect, a car designed to communicate that its owner had no need to be either of those things. The build quality was exceptional by the standards of the British motor industry, which is to say that it was good by any standard and remarkable by the standards of an industry already developing the reputation for inconsistency that would later cause it so much damage. The P4's interior was finished in leather and wood with a care that reflected Rover's understanding of its customer. A man who appreciated craftsmanship without needing to discuss it, who expected things to work properly and noticed with quiet displeasure when they did not. The P5 followed in 1958 and took everything the P4 had established and made it heavier, more substantial, more emphatically itself. The P5 was the car that Harold Wilson was driven to Downing Street in when he became Prime Minister in 1964. It was the car that the palace used, that senior civil servants were allocated, that judges arrived at court in. So its silhouette alone carried the meaning of official authority exercised with restraint. There is a photograph of Wilson arriving at number 10 in a Rover P5 that captures something essential about both the car and the country at that moment. The sense that power could be conveyed in something solid and dark green and utterly without ostentation, that the vehicle of the state should communicate competence rather than glamour. The P5 was Rover's finest hour as an expression of national identity. The car and the idea of the country it served were, for a brief period, the same thing. Then came the P6. Launched in 1963, a departure, a more modern design that attracted a younger buyer without entirely abandoning the qualities that made Rover what it was. The P6 won the inaugural European Car of the Year award in 1964. It sold well. It sold particularly well to the kind of buyer who might have considered a BMW or a Mercedes, but who preferred, for reasons of patriotism or taste or simple familiarity, to buy British. The P6 was proof that the company could evolve, could speak to a new generation while maintaining the engineering integrity that justified its price. What was happening inside the factories during these years was the thing that made the cars possible, and also the thing that would, in time, make the cars impossible. The Rover workforce, concentrated at Solihull for car production and increasingly at Longbridge, as the company's fate became entangled with the wider British motor industry, was a community in the fullest sense. Not people who happened to work in the same building. People whose lives were organized around the works, or whose families had been organized around the works for generations, whose understanding of what it meant to be from Solihull or South Birmingham was inseparable from the fact of the factory. The morning shift began at 6, the walk from the terraced streets, the bus from further afield, the bicycle from the villages that sat between the city and the works, the clocking in, the card punched, the transition from civilian to worker in the space between the gate and the floor, the overalls pulled on, the tools taken up, the day beginning with a particular concentration of skilled manual work where the hands and the eyes are fully engaged, but the mind has a room for other things, the weekend, the football, the family matter that needs attending to, with a problem with the car you noticed yesterday and haven't mentioned yet because you want to think about it first. The smell of the works was machine oil and paint and the particular acrid sweetness of welding. The sound was presses and conveyors and the radio playing underneath it all, permanent background that workers heard without listening to the way people near railways stop hearing trains. The floor vibrated, not alarmingly, perceptibly. A physical pulse you felt through your boots that became so familiar its absence was what you noticed. When the line stopped, the silence had weight. The canteen at break was a social institution. The conversations that ran through a shift, about the work, about management, about the union meeting, about the match on Saturday, were the connective tissue of a community that spent more waking hours together than with their families. The man who worked next to you for 20 years knew things about you that your wife didn't. Not because you told him, because he was there. The wage packet on Friday was the rhythm of the week made physical. The envelope, the cash, the weight of it. The knowledge that this was the conversion of 5 days of labor into the means of living, tangible in a way that a number on a screen would never replicate. The packet went home, some to the housekeeping, some to the pub, some into the tin on the mantelpiece. The transaction was visible. The connection between work and life was direct. The SD1, launched in 1976, was the last car that could claim to be purely and entirely a Rover. David Batch's design was striking. A fastback silhouette that broke with everything Rover had done before, a shape that looked continental, ambitious, modern. It won the 1977 European Car of the Year award. The car was beautiful. It was also flawed. Not in conception, but in execution, in the gap between what the design promised and what the production line delivered. Panels didn't always align. Electrical systems developed intermittent faults. The SD1 was a car that could be magnificent on Monday and maddening by Wednesday, and the inconsistency was worse than consistent mediocrity because it proved the capability was there. The people who built it could build it beautifully. They just couldn't build every single one beautifully. That distinction between the potential and the execution, between what Rover could do at its best and what it actually delivered across a production run, was the crack that everything else would eventually fall through. The merger was already in motion. The car that should have secured the company's independence became instead the last thing it made before independence was taken away. The merger that consumed Rover was not a single event but a process, a series of decisions made over years by people who believed, with varying degrees of sincerity and competence, that they were saving the British motor industry. The logic was always the same. British car manufacturers were too small, too numerous, too fragmented to compete with the scale of European and Japanese producers. Combine them, rationalize the platforms, the factories, the dealer networks, eliminate duplication, achieve the economies of scale that survival required. It was the logic of the spreadsheet applied to an industry built on something the spreadsheet could not measure. The particular identity of each mark, the meaning that a name carried, the reason a buyer chose one badge over another. You cannot put identity on a balance sheet, and so it didn't appear on one. British Leyland was formed in 1968 from the merger of Leyland Motor Corporation and British Motor Holdings, creating an entity that contained, in various states of health and dysfunction, virtually every significant British car manufacturer. Austin, Morris, Triumph, Rover, Jaguar, MG, Land Rover, names that had spent decades competing with each other, now theoretically on the same side. The theory was that this combination would create a company capable of challenging Volkswagen, Fiat, the Japanese. The reality was something else. British Leyland was, from its inception, a company at war with itself. The different marques had different cultures, different workforces, different understandings of what they were and who they served. Combining them under a single management structure did not combine their identities. It confused them. Rover, which had spent decades cultivating its reputation as the maker of cars for professionals and the quietly prosperous, found itself sharing platforms and components with Austin and Morris. The distinction that had justified Rover's premium, the quality of the build, the refinement, the sense that a Rover was a cut above, was harder to maintain when the car shared its underpinnings with something costing a third less. The Longbridge Works became the centre of British Leyland's operations and therefore the centre of its problems. Longbridge in the 1970s was a place of extraordinary contradictions. It was vast, more than 60 acres, tens of thousands of workers. Vehicles produced at a rate that made it one of the most significant manufacturing operations in Western Europe. It was also a place where the gap between what was possible and what was actually happening had become a chasm that everybody on the floor could feel, but that nobody in the boardroom seemed able to close. The industrial relations at Longbridge during the British Leyland years have become a kind of national shorthand. A story Britain tells itself about why its manufacturing declined. The shorthand goes like this: the unions were militant, the workers were lazy, the strikes were constant, and the cars were badly made because nobody cared enough to make them well. Like most shorthand, it contains elements of truth wrapped in layers of distortion. The strikes were real. The disruption was real. The lost production was quantifiable and damaging. But the causes were more complicated than the caricature allows. Management at British Leyland was, by most informed accounts, poor. Not incompetent in every instance, but structurally unable to manage the thing it had created. The company was too large, too diverse, too burdened with legacy commitments and competing internal interests to function as a coherent entity. Investment decisions were delayed or diluted. New models were underfunded. Quality control was compromised by the pressure to maintain production volumes. The workforce had genuine grievances about pay, about conditions, about the constant threat of rationalization hanging over every factory and every worker within the group. The shop stewards who called the strikes were not operating in a vacuum. They were responding to a management culture that had failed to earn the trust that effective industrial relations require. That sentence does not excuse the disruption. It contextualizes it. The distinction matters because the story of British Leyland has been told so many times as a simple morality tale. Unions bad, management helpless, decline inevitable, that the more complicated truth has been obscured. The truth is that everyone involved was operating within a system that was failing, and the system was failing for reasons that went beyond the behavior of any single group within it. The nationalization of British Leyland in 1975 brought the government directly into the picture. The company was losing money at a rate that threatened not just its own existence, but the employment of hundreds of thousands and the economic viability of entire regions. Public money flowed in. With it came public scrutiny, political pressure, and the particular burden of being a company whose decisions were now subject to parliamentary debate. For Rover, buried within this structure, the effect was a slow erosion. The cars that emerged from British Leyland's Rover division were not bad cars. Some were genuinely good. But they were no longer purely Rover. They were compromises shaped by the needs of a conglomerate with too many brands and not enough money. Each shared platform, each reused component, each decision to save money by borrowing from another part of the group took something away from the thing that had made Rover worth buying. The workers at Longbridge were not indifferent to this. They could see the quality changing. They could feel the difference between working on a car the company believed in and working on a car the company had settled for. The pride that had been part of the daily experience, the knowledge that the thing leaving the factory was worth making, was harder to sustain when the thing leaving the factory was a compromise, wearing a badge it hadn't entirely earned. The smell of the paint shop was the same, the sound of the presses was the same, the vibration through the floor the same. But the feeling was different. Something had shifted, and the people closest to the work were the first to know it. The Honda partnership, which began in 1979, was the thing that saved Rover's products and complicated Rover's soul. It arrived at a moment when the company desperately needed what it could no longer produce alone. Modern, reliable engineering developed with sufficient investment to compete. Honda provided it. The collaboration was genuine, technically productive, and in many respects successful. The cars that emerged, the Rover 200, the 600, the 800, were good cars. Reliable in the way Honda's reputation demanded, refined in the way Rover's heritage required, competitive in markets where British cars had spent a decade losing ground. The 200 series sold well. The 600 found buyers who might otherwise have chosen a BMW 3 Series or a Mercedes C-Class, and who discovered, to their surprise, and the surprise of the automotive press, that the Rover was a credible alternative. But credible alternative is a phrase that carries its own limitation. The cars were built on Honda platforms. The engines, in many cases, were Honda engines. The engineering discipline that made them reliable was Honda's discipline, applied through a collaboration that gave Rover access to Japanese manufacturing standards without requiring Rover to develop those standards itself. The question the partnership raised was fundamental. If the platform is Honda's and the engine is Honda's and the quality control methodology is Honda's, then what exactly is Rover contributing beyond the badge, the wood trim, and the particular expectations of a buyer who wants to believe they are purchasing something British? The answer was not nothing. Rover brought design sensibility, interior craftsmanship, and a particular understanding of what its customers wanted from the experience of sitting inside a car. The Rover 800, launched in 1986 as a joint development with the Honda Legend, had an interior that reflected Rover's heritage: leather, wood, a sense of quality in the materials that Honda's own products did not prioritize in the same way. The car felt British in the cabin, even if its mechanical heart was Japanese. Whether that was enough to justify the name was a question that different people answered differently. The Sterling, The name under which the 800 was sold in the United States was supposed to re-establish Rover in America. The ambition was significant. The early reception was promising. American journalists noted the refinement, the ride quality, the sense that this was a car built by people who understood comfort. Then the problems began: electrical faults, build quality inconsistencies, the kind of issues that American buyers, conditioned by Japanese reliability, would no longer tolerate. The Sterling was withdrawn from the American market in 1991. Its promise unfulfilled, its failure a demonstration of the gap between what Rover intended and what Rover could consistently deliver across a production run. The factory could build a beautiful car. It could not build every car beautifully. The same fault line. Still there, still open, still waiting. The privatization of what remained of British Leyland, now rebranded as the Rover Group, came in 1988 when British Aerospace acquired the company. The deal was political in ways that extended well beyond the commercial transaction. So the Thatcher government wanted state-owned industry returned to private hands. British Aerospace wanted diversification. The terms included financial sweeteners from the government that would later become controversial, arrangements that reduced the effective price and that critics described as a subsidy to a private buyer using public money. The workforce at Longbridge, watching another change of ownership pass over their heads, had developed the particular stoicism of people who have learned that the decisions determining their futures are made in rooms they will never enter. The work continued. The shifts ran. The cars were built. Above them, the ownership changed, and changed again. British Aerospace had not bought Rover because it believed in making cars. It had bought Rover because the deal was attractive and because Land Rover represented a business worth owning. The relationship was transactional from the beginning. When a better transaction presented itself, British Aerospace was ready to move. BMW's acquisition of the Rover Group in 1994 was greeted with something approaching optimism. German engineering discipline applied to British brand heritage. The combination seemed to address precisely the problem that had plagued Rover for 2 decades. BMW had the capital, the manufacturing expertise, the quality control systems. The logic was sound. The cultural reality was more difficult. The Germans arrived at Longbridge and found a factory that was, by their standards, antiquated. Not in every respect. The workforce possessed skills and knowledge that BMW's own managers acknowledged, but in the systems, the processes, the infrastructure surrounding those skills. BMW committed significant capital. New models were developed. The Rover 75, which would emerge from this period, was a genuinely good car, built to a standard that reflected what Rover could achieve when properly resourced. But the relationship was strained by something money alone could not resolve. There was a condescension, perceived if not always intended, in the way BMW's management approached Longbridge. Workers who had spent decades building cars found themselves managed by people who seemed to regard that experience as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The phrase that circulated on the shop floor, "I reported in the press with the particular bitterness of people who know they are being patronized," was that BMW regarded Rover as its English patient. A sick thing to be treated. The treatment, as it turned out, would prove more damaging than the disease. The smell of the paint shop carried on. The presses still ran. The floor still vibrated with the rhythm of production. But above the factory floor, in offices in Munich and boardrooms in Birmingham, decisions were being made that the workers would not learn about until the decisions had already been taken. That was the pattern now. That had been the pattern for 20 years. The Rover 75 deserves a moment of its own in this story because it represents the particular cruelty of something arriving too late and too well. Launched in 1998, designed under BMW's ownership with the resources and engineering discipline that Rover had lacked for decades, the 75 was the car that proved Rover could still make something worth wanting. Richard Woolley's design drew on Rover's heritage without imitating it, a modern car that carried the memory of the P5 and P6 in its proportions and its quiet authority without pretending to be a replica. The interior was beautiful, leather and wood and chrome, arranged with a care that reflected what Rover had always understood about the relationship between a driver and the space they sit in. The ride was refined, the engineering was solid. Autocar, reviewing the car, noted that it felt like a proper Rover in a way that nothing wearing the badge had felt for years. The 75 was the answer to the question that had hung over the company for 2 decades. Could Rover still make a car that justified the name? It could. It had. And by the time it did, the company that made it was already being dismantled. BMW's patience ran out in the spring of 2000. The losses were significant, the turnaround slower than projected. The political dynamics within BMW's own boardroom shifted against the British venture. What followed was corporate surgery conducted with a precision that the Longbridge workforce could only watch, unable to intervene, unable to influence, unable to do anything except receive the decisions being made about them in Munich. BMW kept the Mini. The new Mini, developed under BMW's ownership, was about to become one of the most successful small cars in the world, a global brand generating profits for decades. BMW sold Land Rover to Ford for approximately £1.8 billion. Land Rover, the thing that Maurice Wilks had sketched on a beach in Anglesey, the accidental masterpiece, the machine that had gone to every continent and every conflict and every farm track in between, sold to an American corporation. The most valuable thing Rover had ever created. Taken. Remember that sentence from earlier. The thing that was most valuable would be the thing taken from them. Here it is. Here is the taking. And Rover itself, the car business, the Longbridge factory, the workforce, the name, was sold to the Phoenix Consortium for a nominal sum reported at the time as £10. £10. The number deserves to sit in the air. The company that had made the P5 carrying prime ministers, the P6 winning car of the year, the Land Rover going everywhere, the 75 proving the thing could still be done, sold for less than the price of 2 pints in a Birmingham pub. BMW had extracted the valuable parts and left the rest to whoever would take responsibility for it. The Phoenix Four, John Towers, Peter Beale, John Edwards, Nick Stevenson, presented themselves as saviors. Local businessmen with connections to the company. Men who understood the Midlands motor industry. Men stepping forward at the moment of greatest need to keep the factory open and the workforce employed. The narrative was compelling. It was the kind of story the press and the public and the workers wanted to believe. The workers wanted to believe it because the alternative was unbearable. They had watched ownership change hands repeatedly over 3 decades, each time with the promise that this time would be different. The Phoenix acquisition felt different because the men at the top were not foreign corporations or distant conglomerates. They were local. They spoke with Midlands accents. They stood at the factory gates and made promises. The workers who heard those promises wanted them to be true, not naively, desperately. The desperation of people who have invested their working lives in a place and who understand, with the clarity that comes from proximity, that if this doesn't work, there is nothing else. The early months carried fragile optimism. Production continued. The 75 still sold, if not in numbers that would make the company viable long-term. The 25 and the 45 continued finding buyers, though competition from Volkswagen, Toyota and Honda made every sale harder. The workforce adapted with the pragmatism that factory workers develop when they have survived enough changes to know the most important thing is to keep the line running. Keep building. Keep the product moving. As long as cars are leaving the factory is alive. But something was wrong. The wrongness became apparent in stages. The Phoenix Four were paying themselves. That sentence sounds unremarkable, Of course, executives are paid, but the scale and structure of the compensation set against the financial condition of the company would eventually become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the entire Rover collapse. The total personal remuneration received by the 4 directors during their stewardship would later be examined by parliamentary inquiry and government-appointed inspectors whose findings described a pattern of enrichment difficult to reconcile with the stated mission of saving Rover. The workers knew before the accounts confirmed it. They knew the way factory workers always know, through the accumulation of small signals that don't add up. The investment for new models wasn't materializing. The partnerships announced with fanfare, discussions with Chinese manufacturers, potential collaborations, generated press releases but not production lines. The machinery was aging. The tooling for new models wasn't arriving. The gap between the public optimism of the directors and the physical reality of the factory floor was widening. The people standing on that floor could feel it widening beneath their feet. The smell of machine oil, the sound of presses growing older, the vibration in the concrete unchanged, but the future above it hollowing out. The full picture emerged slowly, in stages, through parliamentary questions and investigative journalism, and the slow machinery of official inquiry that grinds forward long after the thing it is investigating has already been destroyed. What emerged was this. During the period of their ownership of MG Rover from 2000 to 2005, the 4 directors received combined personal remuneration of approximately £42 million. 42 million. The number needs to sit in a room with other numbers to be understood. The company was losing money. The workforce was being asked to accept uncertainty, to tolerate short-time working, to continue building cars without confidence that the factory would still be open in 6 months. The investment needed to develop new models to replace aging tooling, to keep Longbridge competitive with factories in Germany and Japan and Korea. That investment was not appearing. And while it was not appearing, the men at the top were extracting tens of millions through a structure of remuneration, property transactions, and related party dealings that a subsequent government inquiry would describe in terms that, while carefully measured in their legal language, left little room for ambiguity. The mechanisms were complex, as such mechanisms tend to be. Property assets transferred. Pension fund arrangements structured in ways that raised questions about whether the workforce's interests had been protected. The inspector's conclusions, published years after the closure, described conduct falling below the standards expected of directors and recommended disqualification. The Phoenix Four were ultimately disqualified from serving as company directors. That is the formal legal consequence. It does not capture what the workforce experienced. What the workforce experienced was betrayal. Not abstract betrayal, the kind that happens in corporate failures everywhere, but specific, personal betrayal. People who had trusted these men with their livelihoods. People who had gone to work every morning building cars because the men at the top told them there was a future. People who had accepted pay restraint and uncertainty and the grinding anxiety of not knowing whether their jobs would exist next month because they believed the sacrifice was shared. It was not shared. The sacrifice was entirely theirs. The reward was entirely someone else's. £42 million in personal compensation. The workforce received statutory redundancy. That sentence contains the entire moral architecture of the collapse. It requires no commentary. It speaks for itself. The end came on the 8th of April 2005. A Friday. The announcement that MG Rover had gone into administration was made that morning, and the effect on Longbridge was immediate. Total. 6,300 workers were told the factory was closing. Not gradually, not through managed wind-down, not through phased redundancy that allows people to adjust and plan. The line stopped. The presses that had been running since before most of the current workforce was born fell silent. 6,300 people walked out of the gates of Longbridge, knowing they would not walk back in. The supply chain was hit simultaneously. Rover did not exist in isolation. It existed at the center of a network: suppliers, component manufacturers, specialist firms scattered across the Midlands whose business depended on Longbridge orders. When Longbridge stopped, they stopped. The estimates varied, but figures most commonly cited suggested the closure affected somewhere between 20 and 27,000 jobs across the supply chain and related industries. 20,000 jobs in the West Midlands, in communities where the motor industry was not merely one employer among many, but the foundational activity around which everything else was organised. The human texture of that day is harder to capture than the financial figures, though the figures are devastating enough. Workers who had been at Longbridge for 30 years walked out carrying personal belongings in carrier bags. Men who had started as apprentices at 16 and known no other working life were, at 50, looking at a labour market with no obvious place for what they knew. The retraining programs established in the aftermath delivered what such programs typically deliver. Useful for some, inadequate for the scale. Insufficient for those whose skills were so specific that transferring them was not a 6-week course, but a fundamental reimagining of who they were. The age arithmetic was merciless. A man of 25 with transferable skills could find his way. A man of 55 with 30 years of body panel work behind him and a mortgage calculated around a wage packet that no longer existed occupied a different position entirely. Too young to retire, too old in the brutal calculation of the labour market, were to compete with younger applicants, too experienced to accept entry-level wages, too proud, in many cases, to accept that the thing they had been, a Rover man, a Longbridge man, a man who built cars, was no longer something the world required. The statutory redundancy payments were calculated by formula. For many workers, they were modest relative to the years they represented. A man who had worked at Longbridge for 25 years received enough to cover a few months of mortgage. The pension arrangements, complicated by questions the inspectors had raised about the Phoenix period, added another layer of anxiety. The certainty that a working life was supposed to build, the pension, the security, the knowledge that decades of labour had accumulated into something was shaken in ways that took years to resolve. The Friday wage packet was gone. The physical envelope had already been replaced by bank transfers in most cases by 2005. But the symbolism held. The connection between work and life, the tangible exchange that made employment feel real, severed. The work had stopped, the exchange was over, the factory was silent, the particular total silence of a place that has stopped making things. The demolition of Longbridge did not happen all at once. It happened the way large industrial sites are always dismantled, section by section, building by building. The slow subtraction of a place that had taken the better part of a century to build, and that took a fraction of that time to erase. The press shops came down first, then the body assembly halls, then the paint facilities, the trim lines, the stores, then the canteen. The canteen, where generations of workers had eaten sandwiches and argued about football and complained about management, and lived the ordinary social life that work provides when work is steady and shared. That came down too. The machinery was sold or scrapped. The tooling that had shaped panels for the 75, for the 25, for the last MGs carrying the Longbridge name, was dispersed to wherever used industrial equipment goes, other factories, other countries, the particular afterlife of things built to make other things that outlive the things they made. Racks emptied, floors swept for the last time, the building's body stripped of its organs, waiting for the demolition crews. What replaced the factory was what replaces factories everywhere in post-industrial Britain: a retail park, housing, a college campus. The Longbridge redevelopment was planned with the careful language of regeneration, investment, opportunity, community. The vocabulary of making something new from something old. In fairness, the redevelopment was not nothing. Bourneville College built a campus on part of the site. Housing was constructed. A Marks and Spencer opened. A Sainsbury's. A Costa Coffee. See the commercial geography of 21st century suburban Britain, arranged on the footprint of 20th century manufacturing. Stand where the main entrance to the Longbridge Works used to be, and the scale of the erasure becomes apparent not through what you see, but through what you don't. There is no ruin, no preserved shell, no cautionary monument, no dramatic silhouette of abandoned industry against the Birmingham sky. The demolition was thorough, the redevelopment was complete. The site has been tidied away with the particular British efficiency applied to things the country would rather not look at for too long. A memorial exists near the site. It is respectful and insufficient in the way that memorials to industrial loss are always respectful and insufficient. Because the thing they memorialize is not a single event but a way of life, and a way of life cannot be captured in a plaque. The community felt the closure in specific practical ways. The pub that depended on after-shift trade lost the after-shift trade. The shops where payday had been a predictable rhythm found the rhythm broken. The houses where mortgages had been calculated around a Longbridge wage needed new calculations, and for some families, the new calculations didn't work. The ripple spread outward through South Birmingham in patterns that economists could map, but that the people inside those patterns experienced as something more immediate. A father who cannot pay the mortgage, a family that has to move. A man who spends 6 months applying for jobs that don't exist in the numbers required, who retrains for work paying half what the factory paid, who adjusts because adjustment is what people do, but who carries the adjustment as a weight that doesn't lift. The supply chain's collapse mirrored the factories. Small firms in Coventry, in Solihull, in towns and industrial estates across the Midlands, firms making brackets, wiring looms, trim components, the hundreds of small parts a car requires, lost their primary customer overnight. Some survived, some did not. The particular ecology of British manufacturing, the web of interdependent specialists that had been the Midlands' character for a century, was torn in ways that affected not just direct suppliers, but the firms supplying those firms, outward and outward, until the effect became indistinguishable from the general background of economic change. Other names survived the company. Names do. Rover passed from owner to owner with decreasing connection to anything it originally meant. The brand rights became intellectual property, a thing to be owned, licensed, potentially monetized. The name that John Kemp Starley chose in 1878, the name that meant wanderer, traveller, unbound, the name carried on bonnets of cars transporting prime ministers and on flanks of vehicles crossing deserts. That name became an asset in the language of corporate transactions. Detached from product, detached from factory, detached from any person who had ever built anything bearing it. Land Rover continued, passed from BMW to Ford, then to Tata Motors in 2008, the brand Maurice Wilks created on a Welsh beach thrived under Indian ownership. The irony is precise and painful. The thing Rover made, its greatest, most enduring product, survived by being separated from the company that made it. The child outlived the parent by being adopted. Come back now to the site. Stand where the main gate used to be, where decades of workers clocked in every morning, where shift change meant the sound of thousands of feet on tarmac and the smell of the canteen drifting through the buildings and the particular energy of a place where people are arriving to make something. The gate is gone. The tarmac is a car park for shoppers. The canteen is underneath a building where students attend lectures on subjects unrelated to cars. The air smells of nothing particular. Coffee, rain on warm paving. The ordinary neutral smell of a place with no industrial memory left in its surfaces. A Rover 75 passes on the Bristol Road, 20 years old, still running. Dark green, well maintained, the kind of car someone has kept because they understand what it is and what it cost to make and what was lost when the place that made it closed. The driver may know nothing about Longbridge, or the driver may know everything. The car doesn't say. It simply continues, carrying its own history through traffic that doesn't notice, past a retail park occupying the ground where the car was born. The machine outlasted the maker. The made thing outlasted the making of it. Somewhere in a garage in Solihull, or a driveway in Coventry, or parked outside a house in one of the villages between, there is a Rover that still starts on the first turn. Still sounds like itself. Still carries, in the weight of its doors and the smell of its leather and the particular way it settles into a corner. So the evidence of what the people who built it knew how to do. Those people deserved better. They deserved better than £42 million paid to 4 men while 6,000 lost their jobs. They deserved better than a retail park where a factory stood. They deserved better than a name sold to the highest bidder and a memorial most people drive past without seeing. They deserved better than the logic of the spreadsheet applied to the work of their hands. They deserved better than being right about the product and wrong about the assumption that being right would be enough. But this is how it ends. Not with the drama the story deserved. Not with a final stand or a public reckoning or a moment when the country stopped and acknowledged what it was losing. With administration, demolition, redevelopment, a Costa coffee, a car park, and the quiet. The particular British post-industrial quiet of a place that has been cleaned up and moved on from, and that carries, if you know where to listen, the faintest echo of presses and conveyors and a radio playing underneath it all, and voices calling across a factory floor in Midlands accents, and the sound of something being made. The sound has stopped. The name remains, on a badge, on a document, on a legal filing in a corporate registry somewhere. Not on a car, not on a factory. Not on the overalls of someone walking through a gate at 6 in the morning to build something the world will want. The name remains and means nothing now except to the people who remember what it meant. They are fewer every year. The retail park does not remember. The car park does not remember. The Bristol Road carries its traffic south toward the motorway and north toward the city, past the place where Rover lived and died and was tidied away. It does not slow down.